So my entire life of being an Atari fan has been haunted by the following advertisements.
I've been making more comparisons between Mattel Electronics Intellivision and Atari. Look at Atari Basketball and Intellivision. I think Intellivision plays much more like real basketball. Here's Atari Soccer and Intellivision. If you try them both, I think you'll find the clear winner is Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
That's right, my friends. The George Plimpton Intellivision ads have always kind of haunted me because they like to tout how much better the Intellivision is over the Atari. So I thought I would explore some of these Intellivision games and tell you what my thoughts are on them as a totally non-biased Atari fan. Now let's just take a look at the controllers real quick. Of course, the Atari controller is a classic 8-way joystick with a single button. Very simple, but it works. On the other hand, the Intellivision has a very odd-shaped disc controller that's very uncomfortable to hold. It also has 3 buttons. The 2 on the top are the same button, and the 2 on the bottom are different. So basically 3 buttons. Plus it also has this keypad, which sadly gets used in the games way too often. So between the two, I would prefer the Atari controller. It's just more comfortable, I think. And while simple, at least it works very well. As for the design of the console, hey, at least the Intellivision has wood grain, but I was always surprised that the cartridge slot is over here on the side, kind of hidden. It is nice that the controllers fit on top of the console though, but again, I'm gonna have to give this one to the Atari design itself. I just think it looks better. But we don't care about the controllers or the styling of the consoles, do we? What we care about is the games. So let's go ahead and take a look at games that appeared on both the Atari and the Intellivision and see which console has the better game. Okay, let's get this started with a game of Armor Battle, which is very clearly a combat-style game for the Intellivision. Now, what I liked about this version is that it's got some pretty good graphics, but the tank is fairly huge, and the controls don't make sense to me as an Atari fan because I'm used to pushing up to move the tank and left and right to turn left and right. But in this game, you push the disc in the direction you want to go. That got a little confusing. Also, this game appears to be a 2-player only game, unfortunately. I can't play against the computer, but then again, combat for the Atari 2600 is also a 2-player game. But yeah, I kind of liked Armor Battle, it's pretty good. And then we have Armor Ambush for the Atari 2600, which is basically the same game, although they have used the correct controls for the tank, which makes it a little bit easier for me to understand. But it's basically the same game with lesser graphics. So the question is, do I go with the game that has lesser graphics but better controls, or the game that has better graphics and worse controls? In this case, I think I'm going to go with the graphics. I can probably get over the controls fairly easily, so I'll go ahead and give this one to the Intellivision. Here we have the premier shooting game for the Intellivision called Astrosmash. And to be honest, I've never really understood the point of this game. Yeah, you're trying to protect the planet by hitting these asteroids before they hit, but if you miss an asteroid, they hit the ground and you lose points. So you could potentially play for, 20 minutes, get all these points, and then just let all the asteroids hit the ground and lose everything. It does get a little bit harder later on with, bombs or something that are hitting the ground. But ultimately, I feel this is a really flawed game, and I really don't understand the point. The Atari 2600 version of the game is called Astro Blast, and it's basically the same game. I mean, the graphics are almost identical, surprisingly, but in this one you use the paddle controllers instead of the joystick, and I feel like that makes it just a little bit more fun. But it's still the same game where you're shooting the asteroids before they hit the ground, and ultimately you could just lose all your points. So, I don't know, that just seemed like a poor decision. It doesn't really make me want to play the game. So in this case, I think I'm going to give the point to the Atari 2600 version because of the paddle controls. Next is Atlantis from Imagic, and this is a pretty well-known Atari game. As you can see, it looks pretty amazing here on the Intellivision. And it's a little bit like Missile Command, where you have a pointer and you're trying to shoot these aliens who are trying to blast your city. It is a little bit different than the 2600 version in the sense that you are aiming where your missiles are going to go. There is a little bit of control drift on this one. If you let go of the controller, it just kind of keeps moving, which I don't really care for. And that may be just a side effect of the controller itself. But I do like the graphics in this for sure. Although, I am used to the 2600 version having a center missile base, or whatever they're called there. We only have 2 in the Intellivision version. And then we have a really cool stage later where you can't see everything and you are using searchlights to attack the enemies. That's pretty neat, I like that. Now here's the Atari version of the game. It's a little bit more simplistic, but the graphics are not too bad, at least on the cities and the bases and the ships. And in this one you have a little less control because all you're doing is pushing the joystick based on which base you want to fire from. So that makes it a little bit easier. And I'll be honest, I've always been kind of used to this style of gameplay for Atlantis. So to play on the Intellivision where you're moving your aiming reticule around is a little bit strange. So the 2600 game is a little simpler, but it's a little bit more fun, I think. So evaluating these two games against each other is really difficult because the playstyle is almost completely different. I almost said that the graphics on the Intellivision version are better. Well, the ground graphics are definitely better, but the actual graphics of the ships and bases and things like that are pretty plain. They're much better on the 2600 version. So ultimately, I think I'm going to have to give this point to the 2600 for the gameplay and the better character graphics. Alright, let's get into the sports games, starting with baseball on the Intellivision. Now, I'm going to tell you up front that I am not going to be reading the manuals on all of these sports games. I feel that they should be simple enough that the controls should be intuitive. Now, the Intellivision baseball game looks really good, but it is only a 2-player game, which I feel really hurts the fun factor of it. To not be able to play against the computer by yourself, I'm not really a big fan of that. Also, the controls are very confusing. I couldn't figure out how to throw the ball back to the pitcher here. I just wanted to throw the ball in and pitch it, but I couldn't even figure out how to do that. I'm sure it's a great game when you're playing with 2 people, but by myself, I didn't really enjoy it very much. Then we go over to the competitor home run for the Atari 2600, and while the graphics are extremely simple and basic, at least you can play by yourself against the computer. So I enjoyed this probably a little bit more than the Intellivision version. And it's not like the 2600 can't do better graphics. Atari proved it with Real Sports Baseball. And even M Network was able to prove it with their version of Super Challenge Baseball for the 2600. And to be honest, I kind of enjoyed the M Network 2600 game better than the Intellivision game. And then of course the pinnacle of all baseball games on these two systems is Pete Rose Baseball, but that was made many, many years later. So it's a tough decision to have to choose between a game that I can't even really play on the Intellivision but has better graphics, or the game that basically has no graphics that I can play on the 2600. So my decision process on this is which game can I actually play, and I'm afraid it's going to have to be home run for the 2600. I'm sorry, the Intellivision game does look way better, but for me, it's just not playable. Alright, next we have basketball, and again the graphics look really fantastic here on the Intellivision. And I think this is a 1-player game, but I'm going to tell you right off the bat that I feel this game is an automatic fail because you have to use the keypad in order to play. The Intellivision has 3 perfectly good action buttons. I don't know why we can't use those. Why do we have to use the keypad? And it seemed like the computer wasn't really doing much, maybe just a little bit of defense. It didn't seem like it was playing any offense at all, but it has good graphics, 6 players on the court, AI that doesn't seem to work because it's probably a 2-player only game, and the fact that you have to use the keypad, I think really hurts it. Then let's take a look at Atari 2600 Basketball. Again, I think this is only a 2-player game. I wasn't able to figure out a 1-player version of it, but again, it's extremely simple. You just grab the ball and shoot it. The graphics are very simple, but it seemed to be a little bit more fun even though it's a 2-player only game. So again, if I had to choose, do I pick the game that has better graphics but worse controls? Or do I pick the game that has lesser graphics and better controls? It's a tough choice, and one that I ultimately I don't really want to make because, like I said, I'm really not a fan of these sports games. So I'm just going to give these a draw. If you like graphics, go with the Intellivision game. If you like gameplay, go with the 2600 game. Alright, here's Beamrider from Activision, and I love this game. I played it a lot on the 2600, and I'm playing it here on the Intellivision for the first time. It's really good, it really is good. I enjoy the graphics and the gameplay here. The control seems a little bit slippery here in the Intellivision game, but I feel like that's the emulator's fault and not necessarily the game itself. What happens is I want to land on a certain line here, but it like skips me ahead to the other line. So you have to basically tap the controls in order to stop at the right spot. It's almost like the Intellivision has analog controls, and I want to play it in digital, you know, where you're just hitting the button one time to go to a different line. But I think that's something that I could get used to. Then we have Beamrider on the Atari 2600, which plays essentially the same, but looks a little bit different. It's almost like you're looking off into a horizon versus like you're playing off on a grid. Both of these games are really, really good, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to give this one a draw. In a sense, I kind of like the 2600's graphics a little bit better, because they're not quite as obtrusive as the Intellivision version. But yeah, both of these games are fantastic. Alright, here we go, back into sports games again, and this is boxing for the Intellivision. I was having a hard time figuring out the controls on this one after I finally got it to work, and it didn't seem like the computer was playing, so I must have been playing a two-player only game here, which again, kind of sucks. The graphics look pretty good. Again, it looks better, but does it play better? That's the question. Good old George Plimpton seemed to think that graphics were the only thing that mattered, but to me, it's really the gameplay, and if it's a fun game, it doesn't matter how the graphics look. And the Intellivision version of boxing, I couldn't quite get into it. And then we come over to the Atari 2600's Activision Boxing, and again, the graphics are not great, and you have to understand that you're looking down on the boxers, but at least this game is a one-player game. I'm playing it by myself here, no problem. Just jumped into it, hit start, and you know, we're boxing. It's easy. It shouldn't be so complicated to start a game. And it just gets down to which game is more fun regardless of the graphics. And in this case, I'm going to have to go with Atari 2600 Boxing. It's not great, but I enjoyed it a little bit more than the Intellivision game. Alright, this one is Brickout. And as you can see, it's very clearly, obviously, a Breakout clone. And I'm honestly surprised that Atari didn't sue over this game. Maybe they did. But as you can kind of see, the ball motion seems to be a little bit jinky. And of course, I'm having to play this with a disc controller. Well, I'm actually using a keyboard, so it's not that great. But anybody playing this would have played it with a disc controller. And to be honest, this game just feels, I don't know, just a little unpolished. And then we head over to the Atari 2600 version of Breakout, which uses the paddle controllers, which is immeasurably better than using the Intellivision's disc controller, or as I was doing it with a keyboard. This moves way smoother, and it's just generally more fun, especially with the paddle controllers. This is an easy win for the Atari 2600. Okay, next let's talk about Bump and Jump on the Intellivision, and it has a really awesome title screen, that's for sure. And the graphics are really, really good, very much like the arcade. It's got some nice music, the sound is really good too, and I think if you like Bump and Jump, you'll enjoy this version of the game. Now let's take a look at the 2600 version of the game, and yeah, the graphics are a little bit more simple. Gameplay seems a little bit faster and a little bit smoother, but I think if I had to choose one game or the other, I'd probably go with the Intellivision version here. I mean, the 2600 version is fine, but I think the Intellivision definitely has the advantage in the game of Bump and Jump. Next is BurgerTime for the Intellivision, and this is pretty much known as the premier home port of this arcade classic. And I've always been a BurgerTime fanatic. I really love this game. And this one's really good. I mean, the graphics and the sounds are good. The only thing I would knock it for is the size of the graphics. The fact that the layout of the stages aren't the same as the arcade. And the touchy controls. I mean, it seems like when I want to go in a direction, he doesn't always seem to want to go the way I tell him to go. But yeah, this is a really good version of this game. And then we come to the Atari 2600 version of the game, and, you know, it's okay, I guess. I mean, the graphics are, you know, a little bit plain. I do like the graphics on the completed burgers down there, but the only enemy that's recognizable is the hot dog. I mean, overall, it's not bad, but, I mean, obviously, if I were going to pick between this and the Intellivision version, I think I would go with the Intellivision version. So score 1 point for the Intellivision. Next is Carnival, and this is a pretty simple game, and the graphics don't need to be that spectacular, and very clearly they're not on the Intellivision. One thing I didn't like about this game is the music. It seems like every time I would shoot or do anything, the music would reset, and I don't know if that's a problem with the emulation or the game itself, but that was very distracting. Also, this version of the game is kind of slow. I don't know if that's also an emulator problem, but I don't know. This game, it's okay, I guess. And then we look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it's basically the same. The graphics are kind of plain. It doesn't really include any music per se, but hey, that's fine by me. But I think because this version runs a little bit smoother, a little bit faster, and the graphics are negligible, I'm going to have to give this to the Atari 2600. Alright, we've done some Mattel games on the Atari. Let's do an Atari game on the Mattel, and that would be Centipede. You know, I'm kind of surprised that Atari would have ported this game to the Intellivision, a competitor. But as you can see, it looks really good. I mean, the mushrooms look like mushrooms, and, you know, the spider looks good. And the only thing I would say about the graphics on this is that the Centipede itself looks a little weird, and the animation seems a little choppy. It's not smooth at all. But other than that, I mean, the sounds are good, and it plays like Centipede, so... Of course, the downside with any trackball game that's been converted home is that, well, you don't have a trackball at home. You're playing it with a disc, so the controller is a bit of an issue in just about any version of Centipede. And then let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game. It feels a little bit faster, a little bit smoother with the graphics, you know, and the sounds are good and all that good stuff. And, you know, the frantic pace of this game is nice, and the sounds are pretty good. It feels like Centipede, but, yeah, again, playing with the joystick is not good. So if I had to choose between the Atari version and the Intellivision version, again, in this case, I think I'd have to go with the Intellivision. I just wish the animation of the Centipede itself was a little bit better. Alright, here we are back to playing a sports game. This is Championship Tennis, and again, I'm not sure what the heck I'm supposed to do here. Why would I want to choose a position? I mean, if I'm playing a tennis game, the position should already be set. And basically, again, it gets down to with these Intellivision sports games, it seems like they just tried to overcomplicate things, which I guess means if you can get to the game, it might be fun, but getting there is, you know, a chore. So now, tennis on the Atari 2600, on the other hand, by Activision, is very simple to start, and it is not a two-player game. You can play against the computer, which is nice. Of course, the computer is pretty much impossible to beat, and the court is a little simple, but, you know, hey, it still plays pretty much like tennis would. But it gets down to the fact that I can't even start the Intellivision version of the game, and believe me, I tried everything. I hit every button, nothing seemed to work. So that makes this decision really easy. The Atari 2600 version of tennis wins. It's the better game because I can actually play it. Next is checkers for the Intellivision, and as you can see, I'm trying to figure out how to select a piece to move. I'm hitting every button on here. Nothing seems to work. The graphics are in a very small window. I mean, even Doom for the 3DO had a bigger playfield than this. I mean, I have literally tried everything trying to select a piece, but it just doesn't work. And, you know, I'm sure they wouldn't have released a game like this that doesn't work at all. So I know I'm doing something wrong here, but it gets down to the fact that it should be simple. It should be easy. These games are not overly complex. I mean, it's a button and a joystick. So let's take a look at video checkers for the Atari 2600. And as you can see, the game pretty much fills the screen. I'm able to move around and select the pieces that I want. I can play against the computer, which is nice. So again, if I had to choose between Intellivision checkers, where I can't even play it, or the Atari 2600 version of checkers, it's another easy win for the 2600. Then we have chess for the Intellivision, and this game actually worked. I was able to select the pieces that I want, move them around on the playfield, and I had an enjoyable time playing this game. I don't understand why it's a window inside of a window inside of a window inside of a window. Why can't they make the playfield a little bit bigger? It's also nice that the pieces are very recognizable, and you even have a timer down there to show how much time you have taken to choose your move. So yeah, this was a good version of chess. I actually enjoyed this one. Now, the Atari version of chess is also a pretty decent version of the game. The graphics are a little bit dithered, which is just a limitation of the Atari 2600. Also, the screen goes all rainbow colored when the system is thinking of its move. That does not happen on the Intellivision version. But this is a decent version of chess. Now, if I had to choose between the Intellivision version and the Atari version, I feel like the Intellivision version of the game is better. The graphics are a little bit cleaner, there's a timer, and it actually plays well. So I'll give this one to the Intellivision. Here's a late release for the Intellivision, Commando, and this is a really good game. The music is good, it plays well, the scrolling is nice and smooth. I had a little trouble with the throwing of the grenade, but otherwise this is a really good version of this game. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and wow, this is really a surprise. The graphics on the 2600 are way better than they are on the Intellivision. The characters are bigger and more colorful, and the trees are more colorful, and it plays well. It's fast, it's smooth. So this is a tough choice. I mean, if I had to pick between the Intellivision and the Atari 2600 version of this game, I mean, they're both fun and enjoyable. However, I do feel that the 2600 version is a little bit more amazing for what it is, and it has better graphics, and the gameplay is just great. That's not to diminish the Intellivision version. That one also has great gameplay. I just feel like the 2600 version is just a little bit better. Alright, here's Congo Bongo for the Intellivision, and as you can see, it's got some really nice pseudo 3D graphics, just like the arcade game does. The sound effects are good, and the controls are really good too. The only problem I have with it is the jumping is a little bit touchy. Trying to get over the waterfall jump is a little bit challenging. And then when I get onto the next screen, the jumping is also extremely challenging. I felt like there was going to be no chance I was going to be able to get across this river here. But yeah, this is a great version of Congo Bongo. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of Congo Bongo, and I can't even believe they tried to make this game. It does have that sort of pseudo 3D look to it, but it turns into this big blobby pixel mess there in the bottom right of the screen. And I don't know if this is the emulator or what, but it just keeps bouncing up and down like that. I don't think the actual game does this. So if I had to pick between the Intellivision version and the Atari 2600 version of this game, I think the clear winner here is the Intellivision version. Next is a game called Deep Pockets, which is a pool game that was created in 1990. Wow. You get little animated cutscenes before the game. You get like the full pool table, and the controls are pretty easy to figure out. There is quite a bit of flickering, but I mean, that's, I guess, to be expected. The controls are good, the graphics are what you would expect, the physics are great. I mean, Deep Pockets for the Intellivision, it's a really good pool game. Now, the only pool game I can think of for the 2600 is called Trick Shot by Magic, and that is also a pretty decent pool game. However, it seems like you're not getting the full game of pool. You're only getting, trick shots, which is fine, I guess. But it would be nice if I could play, an actual game of pool with all the balls on the table. I do like that the balls in this game are much larger than they are in the Intellivision game, but that's about the only thing the 2600 version has going for it. So if I had to pick between Deep Pockets and Trick Shot, I think I would have to go with Deep Pockets for the Intellivision. Next we have Defender, another Atari soft game appearing on the Intellivision. And I do love the way the scrolling is in this game. It's nice and smooth. The enemies feel a little bit jerky though. It doesn't seem like they scroll with the same smoothness as the ground does. And the game feels a little bit faster than it should, I think. But it sounds good, it looks good, it plays good, and I'm not really surprised that Atari is able to make a really great game on the Intellivision. Then we have the classic Atari 2600 version of Defender. I'll tell you up front, I played this game for hundreds of hours. Overall it's a good game, but it never really felt like Defender to me. The sound effects are just not like the original arcade. You're flying over a city instead of like a moon. The motherships don't explode into different pods. You can kind of cheat in this game by carrying a humanoid with you, and the landers won't try to pick up any other humanoids after that. This game has a lot of limitations. So if I had to pick between Defender on the Intellivision and Defender on the 2600, I'm going to say that the Intellivision version is a more accurate representation of the arcade game, and I'm going to give it the point, but my bias towards the 2600 version means I'd probably play it more anyways. Next is Demon Attack for the Intellivision by Imagic. And just look at this game. Look at the graphics on this. They're really good. The downside is the graphics on the characters are just not very detailed, and that seems to be a characteristic of all Intellivision games. But the gameplay is really fun in this one. You have a huge different variety of enemies to play against. And of course, once you defeat those enemies, you get to fly up into space and attack this giant mothership thing that kind of reminds me of the ship from Phoenix. This version of Demon Attack, I think, is the definitive version of this game. So how is the Atari 2600 version of Demon Attack better than the Intellivision version? Well, very clearly the graphics on the demons themselves are better. They're more colorful. You get a nice variety of them. You get this kind of throbbing music, I guess, in the background. And it's definitely very challenging. So if I had to pick between these games, well, I mean, to me, it would just be the Intellivision version, simply because I want to fight against that mothership at the end. This is the definitive version of Demon Attack. Next we have Dig Dug, which I thought was by Atari Soft, but I could be wrong. It looks and plays pretty much like the arcade, although I don't understand why Dig Dug is red. Shouldn't he be blue? This is another Intellivision game where the music kind of tends to repeat. Every time you stop, it starts all over again, which is kind of annoying. I mean, I guess all versions of Dig Dug do this, but this one seems to be more noticeable for some reason. But if you like Dig Dug, this is a really good version. Then we get down to the Atari 2600 version of Dig Dug, and honestly, I've never really been a fan of this version of the game. And I've never really cared for the way the character moves up and down. He's very choppy. But hey, the music is pretty good. I mean, overall, it's a decent version of Dig Dug. There are just better versions out there. This is another one where I think I'm gonna have to go with Intellivision, and it's mostly because the graphics are a little bit better. They feel more like the arcade game. Alright, it is time to talk about Donkey Kong for the Intellivision. Let's take a look at this game. Now, this is widely considered to be one of the worst versions of Donkey Kong, but I want to give it a fair chance here. The graphics are a little bit plain. I mean, at least the girders are, angled like they're supposed to. The sound is, frankly, horrible. The walking animation of I guess that's supposed to be Mario, is just terrible. The little music in between is awful. Mario himself does not look at all like Mario. I guess it's nice that they were finally able to have a multicolored character in a game for once. But by far, the biggest problem I have with this game is the jumping. It just does not feel right. He kind of jumps straight up and then at an angle, but yeah, this is not a great version of Donkey Kong. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong. A lot of people complain about this game being one of the worst games on the system. Honestly, I think Donkey Kong for the 2600 is not really that bad. I mean, at least Mario looks like Mario, and the sounds are fairly decent. I mean, in reality, this is a pretty amazing version of Donkey Kong for the 2600, considering when it was made. I mean, even Pauline looks like Pauline. So if I had to pick between the Intellivision version and the Atari 2600 version of Donkey Kong, I would play the 2600 version all day long over the Intellivision. Then we come to Donkey Kong Jr. for the Intellivision, and surprisingly, this is an improvement over the original Donkey Kong game. The path that you have to take as Jr. is a little bit different than in the arcade though, but this game looked good, and it plays pretty well. I mean, it's pretty basic, especially in comparison to something like the, the Atari 8-bit or the Nintendo version of this game, but overall, it's not bad. Now, the Atari 2600 version, on the other hand, is an affront to humanity. It's so bad. I mean, I'm not even sure what I'm looking at here. The trap jaws definitely don't look like trap jaws. I mean, Mario looks like Mario at least, but Junior, he just doesn't move right. The sounds are ear-gratingly bad, and honestly, it's not even really worth playing. So I shouldn't even have to tell you which game is better between the Intellivision and the 2600 version. Definitely the Intellivision version of Donkey Kong Jr. is better than the 2600 version. Okay, so the next failure of a Intellivision game is Dragonfire, and again, I tried everything to get this game to work. I pushed every button, and I could not get it to start. I mean, is there a button on the Intellivision itself that I'm missing? I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand why why this doesn't work. And this is all I could get. All I could get it was to play this stupid annoying tune. I couldn't get it to start. Honestly, I got frustrated, so I said, screw it, I'm gonna go play the Atari version. And of course, the Atari version starts right up, and it plays fine. It has pretty good graphics for what it is. And I'll be honest, I've never really been a big fan of Dragonfire. I just thought it was kind of a boring game. But if you like Dragonfire, I think this is a pretty good version. The character graphics always seem to be better on the Atari, so I just can't imagine the Intellivision version being any better than this. So again, because I can actually play this game, I've got to go with the Atari version. Next is another Imagic game called Fathom, and I was always kind of fascinated by this game. It always seemed kind of cool to be able to play as a dolphin and a seagull and all that stuff. And originally I could not get the Intellivision game to work. I just started moving the character around and found out that, yeah, that's basically how you start. It didn't work for Dragonfire though. The control is so incredibly slippery, and there's just so many birds here attacking me, I can't even really get too far in it. So then we move on to the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it starts out with you being able to play as the dolphin, and you can swim down and collect the seahorses, and then you can fly up and become the seagull, at which point you still have to fly around and eat the clouds. But the controls in the Atari game are so much better, so much easier to maneuver. Also, the characters are just more detailed and they look better. Fathom on the 2600 is just a more fun game than it is on the Intellivision, and I'm just gonna have to go with the 2600 again. Okay, here's a game called Frog Bog. This is another one of those games that I've just never understood the appeal of this game. All you're doing is jumping back and forth and eating flies. It'd be nice if you could move around on the lily pad a little bit and change your trajectory when you jump, but I tried doing that, it didn't seem to work. But this game has some pretty good graphics at least. I mean, the frogs are pretty boring looking, but the background graphics are nice. And then we get into the Atari version of the game, and it's called Frogs and Flies. I've never understood why M Network changed the names of their games when they appeared on the 2600. But this is basically the same game. You just jump around and try to eat flies. And because it's basically the same game with better graphics on the Intellivision, I'm going to have to give this one to the Intellivision. I mean, if you got to play a game of Frogs and Flies or Frog Bog, I mean, go with the Intellivision version, I guess. Alright, here's one of the most popular games of all time, Frogger on the Intellivision. And this is a pretty decent version of the game. It's a little basic in terms of graphics, but, you know, so is the 2600 version. The controls are good, the sound is okay, I guess, and it plays well enough for Frogger. I always thought it was weird that the logs kind of look like they're pieced together, you know, like there's multiple segments or something like that, and they just put them together. I guess that's an easy way to make the logs look bigger. And then we get into the Atari 2600 version from Parker Brothers, not the Starpath game. That game will blow you away, but this is the Parker Brothers version. And, you know, it's okay, I guess. I've never really cared for the fact that the frog doesn't have a jump animation. He just appears at his location. I do like that the logs are a little bit more detailed than the Intellivision version, but the game is a little bit darker, and the sounds are okay, I guess. I think maybe the music is a little bit better on the Atari 2600. But if I had to choose between the 2600 version and the Intellivision version, I'd go with the Starpath Supercharger version on the 2600. But between the two Parker Brothers versions, I think I'd have to go with the Intellivision game. I think it just looks and sounds a little bit better. Next we have He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, or Power of He-Man, or something like that. I've never really understood what the name of this game is. In this game, I guess you're flying in the Air Raider as He-Man, and you're supposed to be bombing Skeletor down there. It's pretty nice. You can actually tell that Skeletor looks like Skeletor, and the Air Raider has multiple graphics. But I really don't understand the point of this game. I guess you're just supposed to bomb Skeletor, survive or something. I'm not really sure. This might work better if it was more of a Defender style game, but instead I'm just getting hit by these stupid flying fireballs or whatever they are. Then we have Masters of the Universe, The Power of He-Man for the Atari 2600, and it's basically the same game. I still can't figure out the point. I'm just getting hit over and over again. Yeah, to be honest, I don't really think these He-Man games are all that fun. But if I had to choose between the Intellivision and the Atari version of this game, I don't know. I don't think I would go with either of them. I don't really like either of these two games. I think I lasted a little bit longer in the Intellivision version of the game, and it's got some nice background graphics, so I guess I'd go with the Intellivision here. Next is a game of Kool-Aid Man for the Intellivision, and I was really surprised when I saw this game because it is nothing at all like the Atari 2600 game. In fact, I felt like this was more of a horror survival kind of game. Felt like I was being chased by a Kool-Aid Man in this house. I thought I had to maybe escape or something and run away from Kool-Aid Man, which doesn't make much sense. Not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing here in this game, so I just kind of wandered around thinking maybe I need to get the K's for Kool-Aid or maybe escape the house or something like that, but I couldn't figure it out. And then we get to the Atari 2600 version of the game, which, like I said, is nothing like the Intellivision game. Really, all you're supposed to do is stop the, quote, thirsties from drinking your Kool-Aid. And it's a pretty basic game, but it's also extremely easy to understand what you're supposed to be doing here, unlike the Intellivision version of the game. So for me, this is an easy choice. I think I would just rather play the Atari 2600 version of the game, which is weird because it's nothing like the Intellivision. I don't even know what I'm doing in that game. Next we have Lock and Chase, which is more or less a Pac-Man clone, except for there's one slight problem. There's no way to attack your enemies. All you can do is block them by closing off these doors. And, that's okay, I guess, but it just doesn't have the appeal of, say, Pac-Man. And I'm not sure, but I think this may have been an arcade game. But really all you have to do is collect all the dots, I guess it's money, and then escape. And the Intellivision version is nice, it's got some decent graphics. You can kind of understand what's going on. But there is a distinct difference between this and the 2600 version. Unfortunately, the graphics are not as good on the 2600 version of the game. The dots are dashes, which is kind of a hallmark of all the Atari 2600 maze games. But you'll notice one slight problem here, and that is that you can only create doors horizontally. You can't create them vertically. So that and the fact that the graphics on the Intellivision version of the game are just way better, I'm going to have to go with the Intellivision version. If you must play Lock and Chase, go with the Intellivision game. Alright, let's try Mountain Madness Super Pro Skiing on the Intellivision. As you can see, it's got some nice graphics. The trees look nice. The character sprite looks nice. The game has a lot of options. The shushing sounds are fine. It's, sounds like skiing. And there's a lot of different courses, which is good. The only problem I had with the game is the controls. I keep wanting to play it like the 2600 version of the game, where you move left and right. Eventually I figured it out and I was able to do pretty good. And then we come to Skiing from Activision for the 2600, and it's basically the same game. I'm just way better at it because I'm used to the controls. I think the controls are just a tad bit better on the 2600 game, but I don't think there's as many options as there are on the Intellivision, and the graphics are not quite as good. So if I had to choose between Skiing for the Atari or Mountain Madness Super Pro Skiing on the Intellivision, I'd probably still play the 2600 version of Skiing just because it's simpler and easier. But I'm going to give the point to the Intellivision here just because I feel like it's just a way better game. It just has a lot more options and better graphics. Alright, here's Mousetrap for the Intellivision. And this is a pretty well-known Pac-Man clone, well, at least to me. And basically, you just move around the maze eating cheese, and you can turn into a dog at any time and eat the cats. At least I think that's what you're doing, is eating the cats. And the Intellivision version of the game is pretty good. It's got some really good, recognizable graphics. The music is a little annoying, but, I think you can get over it. One of the problems that I did have with the game is that you have to use the keypad in order to change the doors on the map, which is kind of annoying. And also you have to press 5 to turn into the dog. I don't get that. Why not just use the buttons on the actual controller? That doesn't make any sense. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and as you can see, it's just a little bit more simple. You can turn into the dog by pressing the joystick button, and if you move the controller in a certain way, you can change the doors. And it's okay as a game, I guess. The sounds are okay, it looks alright, I guess. It's probably better than Atari 2600 Pac-Man. Ultimately, though, I think between the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, I'd have to go with the Intellivision version of the game. Looks better, plays better, and is more accurate to the arcade. Alright, here we go with yet another sports game. This is football for the Intellivision, and I hate this game. I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do to get it to start. I just got stuck on the screen the entire time. I mean, I guess it looks okay, but I just don't care. I don't care when it comes to these sports games. And basically the same thing that happens with the Atari 2600 version of football. It sucks, I hate it, and I really never want to play either of these two games again. I'm going to say it's a draw, even though I'm sure most people would say if I gave the Intellivision version of the game a chance, I would actually like it. And I'm going to respectfully disagree, because I just don't like either of these games. I don't like football games in general. And then here we go, the torture continues with NHL hockey for the Intellivision. And I gotta give this game some props. It really looks good. I like the angled view of the rink. Looks nice. And this game suffers from the same issue that the basketball game does, in that I don't think the computer is playing. I think this is more meant for a two-player game. Now let's take a look at ice hockey for the Atari 2600 by Activision. I think it actually plays pretty well, even though only one character can have a stick at one time. And it's only 2-on-2. And the character graphics are much bigger and more detailed, colorful. And it's nice that I can actually play against the computer, so... Again, I think if I had to choose one of these awful sports games between the Intellivision game and the 2600, I think I'd go with the 2600 game. Alright, here's the game we've all been waiting for, Pac-Man on the Intellivision. And wow, this game actually really surprised me. It looks really, really accurate to the arcade game. I mean, the maze is a little bit off. It's not quite the same, but it looks really good. It sounds really good. It even plays good. The only downside I could say about this game is that the controls are just a little bit touchy. You know, sometimes I want to go in one direction and I've already passed that point of no return and he just keeps going. So, but that's not really a big deal, not much of a problem. Because as you can tell, when we look at the Atari 2600 version of this game, it's nothing like the arcade game. It doesn't look like it doesn't sound like it doesn't really even play like the arcade game. You know, I'm one of those people that really don't like to knock Pac-Man for the 2600 because it's really its own thing. It's nothing like the arcade. You know, it's still a pretty decent game in its own right. However, if I had to choose between playing the Intellivision version of Pac-Man or the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man, it's not even a contest. The Intellivision version is just 100 times better and more accurate to the arcade. Alright, next let's talk about PBA Bowling for the Intellivision. And I'll admit right up front that this game has some pretty nice looking graphics. And the sounds are not bad too. The ball itself actually sounds like a ball rolling down the lane. However, the big problem that I have with this game is that you have to use the buttons to move your character, and then you have to use a button to position the ball on the lane, which is confusing. I really don't understand why you can't just use the disc controller to move your character up and down. Why do they have to make this so complicated? Also, it doesn't seem like I can throw a straight ball. I just want the ball to go straight down the middle. I can't even get it to do that. So the game looks really good, but the controls are just not intuitive. Now the Atari 2600 game of bowling is just very basic, the graphics are pretty plain, but it's incredibly easy to play. You move your character up and down to where you want him to go, you hit the button and he just lets the ball fly. And at that point you can control the ball. If you want it to arc in a certain way, you can do that. So while the graphics are simple, it's easy to play, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and give this point to the Atari 2600 game of bowling. And I won't hide the fact that bowling is one of my favorite games on the 2600. It's a great little game. Alright, here we are playing golf on the Intellivision, and I'm gonna say right up front, this game is trash. I hate this game. You cannot angle the ball the way you want it to go. You can only go in 90-degree angles, which completely sucks. I can't get the ball to go the way I want it to go. You have a really plain-looking character up there swinging a really plain-looking club. I mean, I guess the only thing it has going for it is that the course looks pretty nice, but I hate this game. Now the 2600 version, on the other hand, is not great, but I think it's more intuitive on how to play. At least I've always thought so. You know, you just move your character around on the course and just try to hit the ball into the hole. The graphics in this case just do not matter. Golf for the 2600 is just more fun. Alright, next let's talk about Video Pinball for the Intellivision, and wow, this game looks really, really good. It's got some pretty decent sounds and pretty good graphics, and the controls aren't too bad. The knock I have against this game is that the ball seems like it weighs 500 pounds and it wants to go straight down the gutter every time, and I barely even had a chance to hit it. So because of that, I didn't really have a whole lot of fun with that game. And then here's Video Pinball on the Atari 2600. It's a game that I have played for countless hours. I admit that the graphics are not great, but I can hit the ball and I can control it with some English and move it around. It has drop targets and rollovers and bumpers and all that good stuff that you'd find in a pinball game. And while I freely admit that this game does not look or play much like an actual pinball game, I still love it. So that makes my decision pretty easy. I feel like I would play Video Pinball on the 2600 over Pinball for the Intellivision. Even though the graphics are better on the Intellivision, it just seems like the physics are against you from the very start. Alright, here is Activision's classic game Pitfall for the Intellivision, and it looks a lot like the 2600 version, doesn't it? However, I'm going to tell you right up front that the controls are complete trash in this game. It seems like you cannot jump straight up in the air. All you can do is jump in an angle, which makes jumping over the logs more challenging. I mean, there's times I want to just jump straight up over the log. I don't want to jump at an angle. Also, I really can't stand the way the vine swings. It looks terrible. But I guess the sounds are okay and the graphics are okay. Anyway, let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, which is a classic. And in my mind, there's no way that any other version of this game is going to be better. I mean, the graphics are amazing, the sounds are good, the music is good, the controls are perfect. There's no question in my mind that the Atari 2600 version of this game is better. Alright, next let's talk about pole position for the Intellivision. I'm not even sure who created this game, but can't possibly have been Atari, because this game is terrible. I mean, sure, the graphics look pretty good, but look at the way the car moves on the screen. It's constantly sliding all over the road. It should not be doing that at all. It should be staying center in the road. I mean, it's got some nice graphics, but the sounds are a little irritating, and the controls are slippery. I just didn't care for this version of the game. Let's compare it with the Atari 2600 version of pole position, and it's got some nice music, it's got some decent graphics, the road scrolls the way that it should, your car is not sliding all over the road, making it almost impossible to play. Sure, the competitor cars are a little plain to look at, but hey, I'll take plain graphics and better gameplay any day. So again, this is just not a contest. The Atari 2600 version of pole position, it's miles better than the Intellivision version. Okay, next we have Popeye from Parker Brothers for the Intellivision, and the graphics look pretty good, but I mean, the problem with most Intellivision games is that it just seems like it doesn't have a very high resolution, so the graphics always look very chunky. This is a pretty decent version of Popeye, it plays pretty well, but the issue that I have with it is the way that the music seems to reset every time. And that seems to be a regular occurrence with Intellivision games. I'm not sure what the deal is. But what's nice is you have all three screens and they all look pretty good. I especially like the ship scene on the Intellivision. It plays pretty much the way that I would expect it to play. Overall, I would say it's pretty good, but again, the music is kind of ear-grating. Next we have the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it is much more simplified than the Intellivision version, but it still plays pretty well. The music does not seem to reset every time like the Intellivision version does. It's almost like the Intellivision only has one sound channel. So I would say the sounds are actually better on the Atari version, but the graphics are better on the Intellivision game. And another thing that bothers me is that the layout of the game is not correct. And I'm jumping on trampolines here in the second stage. That's not correct. So overall, if I had to play one version of Popeye or the other, I'd probably play the Intellivision game, but with the volume turned down. Next we have Q*bert for the Intellivision, and honestly I was kind of surprised by this game. It plays really well with the controller. Of course I am using the keyboard, so it's a little bit different than playing on the disc. The pyramid seems a little bit different on the Intellivision version compared to the arcade, but overall it's not bad, it's pretty good. But it has good graphics, sound, gameplay, and it controls well. So then let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it's okay. The graphics are quite simple in comparison, the sounds are pretty good, the controls always confuse me just slightly, but overall it's a pretty decent version of Q*bert. One thing I've never liked about this version of Q*bert though is the way that you move straight up when you step on one of the discs. I kind of wished he moved diagonally. So, which is the better Q*bert, the Intellivision or the Atari 2600? I think the Intellivision is a better version of Q*bert. Alright, here's another board game called Reversi. And basically in this game you place stones on the board and flip over your enemy pieces. And it's a pretty simple game, however the Intellivision version of the game confuses me a little bit because I thought I could make some of these moves and it won't let me do it. Overall I would say it plays pretty well. And to compare, let's look at Othello for the Atari 2600. And I'm not sure, is Othello and Reversi totally different kind of games in terms of the rules? Because Othello plays exactly the way I would think. All you have to do is place your piece on the opposite side of the enemy pieces and it will flip them over. Of course, trying to do round objects on the Atari 2600 is a little bit complicated, so they didn't even bother. The pieces are square instead of circular. But overall, I would say it's a pretty decent version of Othello. And if I had to choose between these two games, I think I would go with Othello for the 2600 because Reversi just confused me in terms of the moves. I kept getting illegal moves all the time. I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing. So here's River Raid by Activision for the Intellivision, and this game is way different than the 2600 in terms of the graphics. The gameplay is still pretty much the same, but look at how nice this is. It's almost like they thought, hey, you know, we have different hardware on the Intellivision. Let's make a game that looks different. So the graphics are really good here, the sounds are good, the control is good. I love the graphics of the bridge. I mean, it actually looks like a real bridge. And the river itself curves, which is really nice. So yeah, I have to say, I really love the Intellivision version of River Raid. And then we get to the Atari 2600 version of River Raid, which is the original, of course. This is a classic game. I have always loved River Raid. I kind of feel like River Raid is just slightly underrated. The graphics are good, the sounds are good, the gameplay is good, the control is good. But which one would I choose to play between the 2600 and the Intellivision? Wow, that's a really tough choice because I feel like the Intellivision version is incredible. It's amazing. And, you know, the 2600 version is a classic that I've been playing for, 40 years now. My instinct is to go with the Intellivision game just because it looks better. But ultimately, both of these games are fun and fantastic and amazing in their own rights. So I'm going to have to give this one a draw. I think they're both equally fantastic. Alright, here's soccer for the Intellivision. More sports games that I have to deal with here. This one looks like soccer. I love the angled graphics here, the kind of 3D pseudo graphics. It does seem a little bit sluggish though. Almost like it's working really, really hard to put 6 characters on the screen. And again, it seems like this is a 2-player only game. It would be nice to be able to play against the computer, but it was fairly easy to understand how to kick the ball and how to pass the ball and how to shoot the ball and all that good stuff. It was not bad, especially compared to some of the other sports games. I think I could get to where I enjoyed this game. Then we have Pele's Soccer on the other hand, with its top-down graphics. And this game does have AI, but it's pretty relentless. I mean, I can't even really move too much in this game. And the fact that your characters are in this formation that you can't change, it's pretty annoying. So I think if I had to choose between the Intellivision version of soccer and the 2600 version of Pele's Soccer, I'd have to go with the Intellivision game. Okay, here's Space Armada for the Intellivision, and obviously this game is a Space Invaders clone. The graphics are huge in this game, so you can't get all that many invaders on the screen. And it plays pretty well, but the problem that I have is because the graphics are so huge, the bases are constantly getting in the way. I feel like I would have more fun with this game if the bases weren't even there blocking my shots. But it's got decent sounds and it plays pretty well. But then we move on to the Atari 2600 version of Space Invaders. And of course this game is a classic. It's one of the best games for the 2600. The sounds are great. It plays fantastic. There's no flickering in the invaders themselves. And it's pretty much the system seller for the Atari 2600. The original killer app. So which game would I play between Space Invaders and Space Armada? Is it even a question? Of course I'm going to play Space Invaders for the Atari 2600. Alright, here's Space Battle for the Intellivision, and this is one of those games that I hate. I absolutely hate this game. I know that you're supposed to be able to send out your forces to protect your home base here in the middle, but it's just way too complicated for what it needs to be. And at some point you do get out of this screen and you're able to shoot and everything, but let's just get rid of all this strategy nonsense and just go straight to the actual game. So is it any better on the Atari 2600? Well, no. It's the same irritatingly annoying game, and I'm still not able to get to the battle screen. These games are so simple, and I should be able to just hit a button and just start playing the game and not have to read some huge manual in order to figure it out. So if I had to pick one of these two games, I'm going to say neither. And in fact, I feel like I should give them both a negative point because I hate it so much. But I'm not. I'm just going to give them a draw. Alright, next is Stampede from Activision on the Intellivision. And this is Stampede on the Intellivision. I mean, it's pretty much indistinguishable from the Atari version. And it has the same sounds and same graphics, basically. So then let's look at the Atari 2600 game. And as you can see, like I said, it's almost identical. And I feel like they kind of dropped the ball on the Intellivision game because they could have made it a little bit better. They could have done something new, but they didn't. They just chose to play it safe. And it's the exact same game. So I guess I'm going to have to give this one a draw as well because there's really nothing distinguishable from these two games. Alright, here's Star Strike for the Intellivision, and this came out during the craze of Star Wars, and everybody wanted to come up with a game where you're going down a trench attacking some giant base. And I kind of like the graphics here. They look pretty cool, especially with the Earth in the background that moves into place very slowly, and you basically just have to destroy this giant Death Star thing, I guess. And while it's got decent graphics, I just feel like the gameplay is just incredibly lacking. It's really just kind of a boring game, really. There's really nothing exciting about it. So then let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and you know, it's basically the same, but just not quite as good of graphics. For some reason, this one made a little bit more sense as to how to play, and I felt like I was more in danger in this game than in the Intellivision version. But ultimately, if I had to pick between the two games, I think I'd go with the Intellivision game. I mean, the graphics are substantially better, and I think overall that makes it more enjoyable than the 2600 game. Next, let's talk about Parker Brothers' Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back for the Intellivision. And this is a pretty good version of the original Star Wars game, and the graphics look pretty decent. The sounds are okay, I guess, but the problem with the game is that it seems very jerky. The scrolling isn't all that smooth, and it's hard to move right for some reason. And it seems like the walkers start out a lot closer to your base than in the Atari game. But the controls are nice, the graphics are good. Overall, it's a pretty decent version of this game. Now let's compare it with the original Atari 2600 version, and this, as you know, is another classic for that system. And while the graphics are not quite as good as the Intellivision game, the sounds are really fantastic and the gameplay is amazing. The control is great. And for me, it's not a very difficult choice as to which one I would pick between the two games. I would always go with the Atari version of this game. It's just smoother and plays better. And overall, I think it's just more fun. Alright, here's Super Cobra for the Intellivision, and my first thought on this game is, what the heck is going on with the scrolling on the top? It's almost like they couldn't figure out how to create a status bar, so they just constantly scrolled your score and your fuel across the top. And I find that to be incredibly distracting. However, I will say that the scrolling itself is nice and smooth, which is kind of unusual for Intellivision games. But like most Intellivision games, the graphics are detailed, but only one color, so it gives it an air of being really basic. But overall, Super Cobra on the Intellivision is a pretty good game. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 game from Parker Brothers. And hey, look, we have a chopper that has more than one color. And we have the score that stays at the same place on the screen. Granted, the scrolling is pretty awful, and the enemies are one color just like the Intellivision game. And the graphics are not very detailed. Look like we're playing in Tron World or something like that. So I think between the two games, I would have to go with the Intellivision version of the game. I've never really been much of a fan of the 2600 game to begin with, and while that scrolling text at the top of the Intellivision game is incredibly annoying, at least the scrolling is not killing my eyeballs like it does on the Atari game. Alright, here's one of the premier games for the Intellivision, Tron Deadly Discs. And the graphics are decent in this game. I kind of like the pseudo 3D background. Basically, all you have to do is attack these three enemies with your disc, destroy them, and move on to the next stage. But it's easier said than done because you have to use the keypad in order to throw your disc. I feel like this game would be better if I could just be moving in a certain direction and then hit the button to throw the disc. Kind of like any other top-down game like this. But instead they were trying to do more of a Robotron style where you can throw and move in two different directions, and I think that really hurts the game. That said, let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and it plays exactly the way that you would expect it. As you're moving your character, he will throw the disc in the direction that you're currently moving. It's just way more intuitive to play this way. And sure, the graphics are a little bit more plain, but the sounds are good, and the gameplay is really, really great. So between the Intellivision game and the Atari 2600 game, surprisingly, I'm going to say that the Atari 2600 game is better than the Intellivision game. I'm really kind of sad to say that because I thought the Intellivision game would be great, but the controls just kill it. Next we have Tutankham from Konami, and in this game you are a treasure hunter traveling through a dungeon, trying to find keys, trying to find treasure, avoiding snakes, and all that good stuff. And this is based on an arcade game, but as you can see the graphics are pretty good. The sounds are decent enough, at least I don't have music that's blasting my ears. The one problem I've had with any version of this game is that you can only shoot left and right. You cannot shoot up and down. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But Tutankham for the Intellivision, that's a pretty good game. Good graphics, good sounds, controls are nice. Now let's take a look at the Atari 2600 version of the game, and yeah, it's not good. Again, you can only shoot left and right, but the graphics are just they're kind of weird. I feel like they just overdid it with the color rainbowing effect here, and it would be nice if they were just solid graphics. The controls are okay, I guess. But if I had to pick between the Intellivision and the Atari 2600 version of the game, which I pretty much hate anyways, I would definitely go with the Intellivision game. Alright, well there you have it, Intellivision versus Atari, and honestly, I think this is a tie. Both systems are really, really good, and hey, if you prefer one system over the other, more power to you. So which games did I get right and which games did I get wrong? Please let me know down in the comments. I appreciate you watching, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye everybody.